In this class, we're going to analyse the grammar and the vocabulary of a different story than the last story. We're going to look at Exhalation, which is a science fiction story by Ted Chiang. So we're going to look at the phrase and clause structure, and we're going to try and see why this won prizes, for example, why this has won literary prizes. It's clearly considered a good book. Okay, so we're going to start with: it has long been said that air, which others call argon, is the source of life. Now notice that he then goes on to repeat this phrase, the source of life, the true source of life. There's quite a lot of repetition in this text. So he starts by making quite an interesting statement. He says, this is not in fact the case. And that's obviously quite a strange thing to claim, that air is not the source of life. And I engrave these words to describe how I came to understand two things. He came to understand the true source of life, and, as a corollary, he came to understand the means by which life will one day end. So he seems to have got some kind of understanding about the beginning of life and about the end of life, all at the same time. So already he's giving us some kind of understanding that the origin of life and the end of life are in some way connected. And he's done that very skillfully with that very first sentence. Okay, now we come down to the second paragraph, and do notice the variation in the different phrases and clauses that he uses. So he's got a prepositional phrase here for most of history, then he's got a comma, and then he's got the main clause. The proposition that we drew life from air was so obvious that there was no need to assert it. Okay, so quite a long main clause there. And then he goes on to explain, every day we consume 2 lungs heavy with air. Every day, notice that repetition, every day, every day. Okay, so there's repetition there. We consume 2 lungs heavy with air. Every day we remove the empty ones from our chest and replace them with full ones. So you've got full ones being contrasted with empty ones. And he starts using the word heavy to describe the lungs. And he then goes on to use the word heavy to describe the limbs, the heaviness of the person's limbs. Okay, he then uses an if sentence, so he's using a subclause at the beginning. If a person is careless and lets his air level run too low, comma, he feels the heaviness of his limbs and the growing need for replacement. So he feels 2 things. He feels the heaviness of his limbs and the growing need for replenishment. So they're 2 nice balanced noun phrases there that he's got at the end in the main clause. If we go further, we see it is exceedingly rare that a person is unable to get at least 1 replacement lung before his installed pair runs empty. So we've got run too low, runs empty, and we've got replace, replenish, replace. Yeah, there's that repetition going on, and we've got lung again mentioned. So there's really quite a lot of repetition going on there. And he's decided to use a semicolon for the last 2 main clauses. Okay, and he's got some dashes to insert an interruption. And it's a subordinate clause that's interrupting. It's when a person is trapped and unable to move, with no one nearby to assist him. So a subordinate clause and a prepositional phrase. He interrupts the first main clause. Okay, if we go on to the next sentence, next paragraph, excuse me, we get a fronted adverbial, but in the normal course of life, comma, our need for air is far from our thoughts, comma, and indeed many would say that satisfying that need is the least important part of going to the filling stations. So then we've got a coordinating conjunction and another main clause. And notice this bit of anadiplosis, to the filling stations, for the filling stations. This anadiplosis is where you get a repetition of words at the end of a sentence and then at the start of the next sentence, or at the end of a clause and then at the start of the next clause. So there's a little bit of anadiplosis. And then he goes on to use 2 appositives. He says, for the filling stations are the primary venue for social conversation, comma, and then he renames the primary venue for social conversation as the places from which we draw emotional sustenance as well as physical. Okay, so he's using he's using a defining relative clause there from which we draw emotional sustenance. So it's a new type of clause that he's put in here to keep his writing interesting. And he's certainly got two A positives there. The primary venue is being renamed the places. Okay, the primary venue for social conversation and the places from